Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. We're looking at post-World War I America, and honestly, it's a massive pressure cooker of ethnic, cultural, and ideological divisions. It's super tempting to picture a victorious nation just marching forward in perfect unison after the war, right? But the reality? Well, it was far more turbulent. We're talking about a time when all those intense wartime pressures suddenly popped, leading to an absolute explosion of domestic conflicts. To really wrap our heads around this chaotic era, we're going to break it down into 5 key themes. 1. The myth of unity. 2. Racial and ethnic divides. 3. Prohibition and culture wars. 4. Socialism and industrial unrest. And 5. The Red Scare crackdown. Let's get to it. Section 1. The myth of unity. Wartime patriotism versus reality. Outwardly, the government pushed this massive sense of patriotic unity. There was huge mass support for our boys overseas. Newspapers, popular music, public rallies. They all painted this picture of one unified nation. But beneath that shiny patriotic veneer, joining the war actually sparked immense internal stress. Suddenly, there were intense suspicions about the loyalties of recent immigrant communities. We saw this brand new hostility toward anyone perceived as a, quote, unreliable foreign element, which basically just took existing divisions and dialed them up to an 11. Now, you've probably heard the phrase melting pot, right? It was actually popularized by a 1909 New York City play, and it gave this cozy idea that different races met and mixed freely in America. But the reality on the ground was a deeply segregated patchwork quilt of ethnicities, and that came with a massive potential for conflict. Take Lower Manhattan, for instance. It was strictly divided. You had the Chinese community here, the Italian community there, so the idea of everyone just melting together harmoniously, at this time it was pretty much a complete myth. Moving on to Section 2, Racial and Ethnic Divides, Segregation and Hostility. Okay, the absolutely crucial concept to grasp here is nativism. Think of nativism as an ideology focused on protecting the interests of native-born or established inhabitants against the interests of immigrants. And this wasn't just some fringe idea, you guys. It was explicitly promoted in official, high-level academic circles. For example, the 1911 Dillingham Report flat out claimed that new, non-white, and Catholic immigrants were totally unsuited to American life. You also had this exact same nativist ideology pushed heavily in Madison Grant's highly influential 1916 book, The Passing of the Great Race. Basically, the stage was being meticulously set for some severe, systemic exclusion. In these ethnic divisions, they manifested on the ground in truly devastating ways. Starting in 1915, there was a massive resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. Down in the South, these divides were legally enforced through strict segregation, literally unpunished lynchings, and zero civil rights for Black communities. But hey, this wasn't just a Southern problem. In 1919 alone, the North saw over 20 race riots, with the absolute worst breaking out in Chicago. These northern riots were heavily fueled by the racist depictions in the 1915 movie The Birth of a Nation, compounded by the growing tensions as Black Southerners began migrating to northern cities. The country was practically tearing at the seams. All right, Section 3, Prohibition and Culture Wars, the battle over morality. To really understand the 1920s, we have to talk about the culture wars, and that means defining the two factions fighting for the very soul of the American public, the wets and the dries. The dries were activists campaigning incredibly hard against what they saw as the social and moral evils caused by alcohol. On the flip side, the wets fiercely opposed prohibition and fought to keep drinking completely legal. So how did the dries actually pull this off? Well, they brilliantly weaponized the exact conditions of the First World War. They were massively boosted by the wartime demand for national discipline. Plus, all that anti-German propaganda fit perfectly with their campaign to shut down German-owned breweries. With backing from progressive leaders, including President Woodrow Wilson himself, the dries finally pushed through the 18th Amendment in January 1919. But the wets didn't just roll over. They represented this massive undercurrent of public opposition that kept fighting back for the rest of the entire decade. The law may have changed, but the culture war was absolutely raging. We also need to formally define the Volstead Act. See, while the 18th Amendment banned the alcohol, it was the Volstead Act passed by Congress that laid out the precise methods for legally enforcing this prohibition. That officially took effect in January 1920. And it's actually super fascinating because this act went into effect the exact same year as the 19th Amendment, which finally granted women the right to vote. These two huge societal shifts were deeply linked. Organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union were instrumental in campaigning for both prohibition and women's suffrage. So two massive progressive causes crossed the finish line together, permanently altering the country. Shifting gears to Section 4, Socialism and Industrial Unrest, Strikes and Economic Contraction. So, when the post-war economic mini-boom of 1919 suddenly turned into rising unemployment, Americans started looking for a scapegoat. And they didn't blame the economic system itself. They blamed radical ideologies. This brings us to communism. We need to define this clearly. Laid out by Karl Marx in 1848 and 1849, communism is an ideology supporting revolutionary socialism aimed at completely destroying capitalism, private property, and organized religion. This absolutely terrified mainstream America. Why? Because the 1917 Russian Revolution had just proven to them that a tiny group of extreme socialists literally could take over an entire nation. Digging one layer deeper, we have Bolshevism. This was the specific revolutionary Marxist current that actually seized power in Russia in October and November of 1917. Now, the Bolsheviks were just one specific strand of revolutionary movements, but their success, along with their really loud calls for a global communist revolution, triggered widespread panic in the U.S. Suddenly, folks were deeply terrified of immigrants arriving from Central and Eastern Europe. Adding absolute gasoline to this fire of panic was anarchism. This was a radical political movement that quickly became the scapegoat for almost every single labor dispute in America. But the public's fear turned very real when radical anarchists started taking violent action. They literally mailed bombs to capitalist leaders like John D. Rockefeller and public officials like Seattle's Mayor Hansen. On June 2, 1919, they coordinated bomb attacks in 8 different American cities. Suddenly, the threat wasn't abstract anymore. It was literally on their doorsteps. In the sheer panic of 1919, the authorities completely failed to distinguish between these very different groups. On one hand, you had moderate socialists. They just wanted to achieve socialist ends peacefully, right, through the normal democratic process. But on the other hand, you had the Bolsheviks, who actively supported violent revolution and the total destruction of capitalism. In the heat of the moment, the government and the American public just lumped them all together into one massive existential red threat. And all this political panic, it's playing out against a backdrop of staggering industrial unrest. We're talking about over 4 million workers going on strike in 1919 alone. Just think about that scale for a second. In Seattle, in February, 60,000 workers walked out, led by the IWW, heavily opposed by Mayor Hansen. In September, 75% of the Boston police force, mostly Irish Americans, went on strike for union rights. That event actually made Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge a national star just for breaking the strike. That very same month, the Great Steel Strike kicked off, lasting 3 months until U.S. Steel brutally crushed the union, leaving 6 strikers dead in the Centralia massacre. This massive economic instability absolutely terrified the public, practically begging the government to step in with a heavy hand. Which brings us to Section 5, the Red Scare Crackdown, Government Action and Deportations. Government suppression ramped up incredibly fast. It started with wartime loyalty tests, but by 1917, the Espionage Act was passed to target subversion and allow surveillance of suspicious mail. The very next year, 1918, brought the Sedition Act, which led to over 1,500 prosecutions. Then, right after those 1919 bombings we just talked about, we get the infamous Palmer raids, where the government seized documents and arrested thousands of people without due process. Finally, this massive wave of anti-foreign, anti-radical sentiment peaked with the 1921 Emergency Quota Act, which placed incredibly drastic limits on the number of immigrants legally allowed into the U.S. You know that old saying, "It is better to give than to receive"? Well, it was actually used as a deeply cynical cartoon caption at the time, celebrating the December 1919 deportation of 249 Russian quote-unquote subversives. They packed them all onto the USS Buford, which the press gleefully nicknamed the Red Ark. Among those deported back to Russia was the famous anarchist and feminist Emma Goldman, who had already been jailed for urging men to refuse the military draft. The scope of this crackdown was just massive. U.S. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer and his young assistant J. Edgar Hoover cast an incredibly wide net. They went after anarchists, pacifists, the American Communist Party, militant trade unions, and honestly, just everyday German Americans and Eastern European immigrants. They even locked up the prominent socialist leader Eugene Debs under the Espionage Act. Get this. Debs actually won 900,000 presidential votes in the 1920 election while sitting inside a prison cell. No way, right? Ultimately, though, this Red Scare kind of blew itself out. Palmer boldly predicted a massive communist revolution would break out on May Day 1920, When the day came and literally nothing happens, Palmer lost all his credibility, and the worst of the immediate panic faded away. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought to chew on. How do periods of sudden national stress reveal and exacerbate deep underlying fractures within a society? The 1920s American pressure cooker shows us exactly how fast the outward illusion of national unity can shatter when a society gets squeezed by economic contraction, wartime paranoia, and rapid cultural shifts. It's a pretty stark reminder of how fragile societal harmony really is. Thanks for hanging out with me today, and I hope this leaves you wanting to dive even deeper into this completely wild chapter of history.